She once knelt before the man she called her husband, her hands trembling, her eyes red, her heart broken on the cold marble floor. And he? He poured her more wine. 3 years later, she stepped out of a black armored limousine in Manhattan. Not a tear, not an apology, arm in arm with the man the city dared not look directly at. This is the story of Seraphina Vale, about what betrayal creates when it doesn't kill you. Please like, comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about revenge. The dinner had cost $4,000. Seraphina knew that because she'd arranged every detail herself. The hand-rolled pasta imported from a small shop in Bologna, the wine from a Burgundy estate that only produced 300 bottles per year, the crystal glasses she'd spent 40 minutes selecting at a boutique on Fifth Avenue because the refraction of candlelight through the stems reminded her of something her mother once said about beauty being worth the trouble. She'd spent 3 weeks planning the anniversary dinner, 3 weeks choosing flowers, confirming the private chef, selecting a dress that that Damien would notice. She always got the names confused now. Years later, looking back, she would understand that confusion as the first honest thing her body ever told her about her marriage. The table was set by 6. By 7, the candles had burned down a quarter of an inch. By 8, the pasta had gone cold, and the Burgundy sat breathing in its decanter like something patient and doomed. Damien Cross walked through the penthouse door at 9:43. He didn't apologize. He never apologized. Not because he lacked the vocabulary for it, but because apology required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required him to look directly at something he'd rather keep peripheral. He moved through the apartment with the practiced ease of a man who'd furnished it himself and therefore owned every surface within it, dropping his jacket over a chair, rolling his cufflinks loose at the wrist, already reaching for the whiskey on the bar cart before he'd fully crossed the threshold. Seraphina stood at the dining table with her hands at her sides. She noticed the collar first, pink smudge along the fold, half hidden where the shirt met the neck. The kind of mark that required proximity, the kind that required a mouth. She'd seen it before, twice, maybe 3 times in the last 18 months, and each time she'd told herself a different story, each story smaller and more desperate than the last. Dry cleaning, a client dinner, cosmetics transfer from a handshake. She'd been elaborate in her self-deception. She'd been almost talented at it. Tonight she didn't construct a story. Tonight she just looked. "You missed dinner," she said. "I had a meeting run long." He poured 2 fingers of whiskey without looking at her. "There's food here?" There was. He finally turned, registered the table, the ruins of it, the extravagance she'd assembled and he'd rendered pointless by his absence. And something crossed his face that wasn't guilt exactly, more like mild inconvenience, the expression a man makes when he realizes the dry cleaner closed early. "Sarah, don't." The word came out quieter than she intended. Not soft, not pleading, just quiet, the way a door sounds when someone finally decides to close it all the way. "Don't do that thing where you start a sentence with my name like it's an apology." He set down the whiskey glass, and that was when the elevator opened. Seraphina heard the mechanism first, the pneumatic hiss of the private lift that connected the penthouse to the building's resident entrance, the one only residents could access, the one only she and Damien had the code for. She turned toward it slowly, the way the body turns toward things it already knows will be terrible. Some deep animal intelligence in the nervous system that moves ahead of conscious thought. The woman who stepped out was perhaps 26, dark-haired, long-limbed, wearing a coat that Seraphina recognized as Italian. She'd almost bought that coat herself 3 seasons ago, before deciding against it. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who've been told so consistently that beauty has become simply one of their logistical facts, like height or blood type. She was also, unmistakably, pregnant, maybe 5 months, maybe 6. The kind of visible that can no longer be managed by fabric choice. Seraphina's mind processed this information in pieces, the way a windshield cracks, not all at once, but radiating outward from a central point of impact, each fracture following its own quiet logic. The woman looked at Seraphina with an expression that was almost apologetic before something harder moved behind her eyes. Then she looked at Damien, and the expression shifted entirely, became something warm and proprietary and certain of its welcome. Around her neck hung a necklace, Seraphina's wedding necklace, white gold with a single pear-cut diamond that Damien had given her the morning after their ceremony, pressing it into her hands over room service coffee in a Paris hotel, telling her it had belonged to his grandmother, that she was the only woman he'd ever trusted with it. She had worn it for 4 years. She touched her own throat now, instinctively, and found it bare. She'd removed the necklace 2 nights ago because the clasp had been irritating the skin at her nape, and she'd placed it in the dish on her bedside table, and apparently sometime between then and now, the world had reorganized itself into something she no longer had a map for. Seraphina. Damien's voice had changed register. Lower now, almost cautious. This isn't... What is her name? Seraphina asked. Silence. Her name, Damien. Vivienne, the woman said herself, stepping fully into the room, one hand resting against her belly in a gesture that was either unconscious comfort or deliberate declaration. Seraphina couldn't tell, and suspected both were true simultaneously. Vivienne Marsh, and before you say anything... I wasn't going to say anything to you, Seraphina said. Her voice surprised her. It was steady. Not the steadiness of self-control, but the steadiness of something that had simply stopped, like a clock whose battery has died, still showing a time but no longer moving toward anything. This isn't about you. She looked at Damien. He met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. That was the moment. Not the necklace, not the pregnancy, not the 47 missed calls she'd cataloged over the previous year, not the business trips to cities where she'd later found receipts for hotel rooms with king beds when Damien was supposed to be staying in corporate suites. The moment was those 2 seconds, the duration of his eye contact, the speed of his retreat from it. The information contained in that small movement was total and final and required nothing further. You were never built for this world, Sarah. He picked up his whiskey again, not aggressively, almost wearily, as though this conversation was a formality both of them had been postponing out of simple exhaustion. You're too soft. You always have been. This life, what I do, what I am, you've never really understood any of it. She stood very still. In her chest, something was happening that she had no immediate name for. It wasn't quite grief. Grief was the word she'd expected, had been bracing for without realizing it. But this was something different, colder, more structural, like watching a building you've lived in assessed by an engineer and condemned. The feeling wasn't, I am losing something. The feeling was, I was never actually inside this to begin with. She crossed to the dining table without speaking. She collected the 2 place settings. The plates she'd warmed in the oven, the silverware she'd polished that afternoon, the crystal glasses she'd spent 40 minutes selecting, and carried them to the kitchen. She set them beside the sink. She untied her apron. She folded it. Then she went to the bedroom, opened the top drawer of her vanity, and removed the folder she'd placed there 11 days ago. She'd found the divorce attorney through a friend of a friend, a woman she'd met twice at gallery openings, someone she'd liked instinctively, someone whose opinion of Seraphina she didn't particularly need to maintain. The attorney's name was Clara Renwick, and she'd been thorough and unsentimental and had charged $800 an hour without apology, which Seraphina had found bracing and correct. The papers had been ready for 11 days. She carried them back to the living room. Damien looked at the folder, then at her. Sarah, stop calling me that. She placed the papers on the table beside his glass. My name is Seraphina. You only started shortening it when I started becoming inconvenient. She picked up a pen from the side table, the one she kept for signing for deliveries, a ballpoint, nothing ceremonial about it, and she signed her name in 3 places where Clara Renwick had marked small yellow tabs. Her handwriting was steady. She noticed this with a detached kind of clarity, the way you notice weather from inside a car. She removed her wedding ring. She placed it beside his drink. Damien said nothing. He watched her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. There was something in it that might have been genuine surprise or might have been the performance of surprise, and she realized with finality that she could no longer tell the difference, that she may never have been able to, that this uncertainty had perhaps been the central fact of their marriage from its first week. Vivienne said something. Seraphina didn't hear it. She was already in the bedroom changing her shoes. By the time the city outside began its pre-dawn quieting, that hour between 3 and 5 when even Manhattan briefly suspends its noise, Seraphina Vale had packed 2 suitcases, called a car, and descended 43 floors to a street still wet from rain she hadn't noticed falling. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold with her 2 bags and her bare ring finger and the strange lightness that comes not from resolution but from the end of sustained, exhausting pretense. She didn't look back at the building. She got in the car. She told the driver an address in Brooklyn, a sublet she'd found 3 weeks ago when something in her had apparently known what her conscious mind was still refusing to finalize. And as the city moved past the windows in its usual indifferent luminescence, she felt the first actual tear she'd shed all night track down her left cheek and drop silently onto the collar of her coat. Just the one. Then she straightened her back and watched the bridge lights come. 3 years is a strange unit of time, long enough to become unrecognizable to people who knew you before. Short enough that the person you used to be still occasionally shows up in your peripheral vision, standing in doorways, watching. What Seraphina did with those 3 years, no one in her former life knew precisely. The women she'd called friends, women who were Damien's friends first, who'd welcomed her into their circle with the warmth of people auditioning for their own social positions, noticed her absence for approximately 2 social seasons before filling the space with someone easier, someone who didn't ask complicated questions at dinner parties. Damien's name continued appearing in the financial press. His firm expanded. Vivian's pregnancy resolved into a child whose photos appeared on an Instagram account. Seraphina looked at once and then never returned to. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in October. Clara Renwick called with the news at 9 a.m., and Seraphina was already in a meeting. She'd taken a position with a private asset recovery firm operating out of a narrow building in the financial district, the kind of company that didn't appear in directories, that sourced its work through referrals only, that specialized in finding things people with significant resources had lost or hidden or had taken from them. She'd entered as an analyst. Within 8 months, she was running case strategy for 3 of their largest accounts. She had a talent for pattern recognition, for reading the architecture of financial deception, finding the load-bearing lies, understanding which threads, pulled, would unravel the entire structure. The work suited something in her that the marriage had never touched. She was 29 years old, and she slept well for the first time in memory, and she bought her own wine now. Not $4,000 bottles, nothing imported specifically for a dinner that would be ruined, just wine she liked, opened when she wanted it, and she did not miss Damien Cross in the way she'd feared she would. She missed the idea she'd held of her own life, the shape of it, the future she'd built in imagination, that she grieved in efficient installments during a year that was hard and clarifying in equal measure. In the second year, she met a man named Elias Park at a conference in Geneva. He ran a financial intelligence operation with clients across 3 continents. He was quiet and precise and laughed infrequently but genuinely, and he found her work interesting in a way that felt like respect rather than strategy. They had dinner 4 times over 6 months. He kissed her once, near the end of a long evening in a bar overlooking a lake. She didn't pursue it. Something in her wasn't ready yet. Or wasn't interested in ready, was instead interested in something she didn't yet have a name for. Something harder and more purposeful than ready. It was through Elias that she first heard the name Roman Castellano. "There's a man," Elias said near the end of their 4th dinner, when the conversation had drifted into the territory both of them knew most intimately, the intersection of money, power, and organized illegality. "He operates out of New York, financial empire that's partially legitimate, real estate, private equity, shipping, and partially something else entirely. Nobody moves against him. Not the families, not the federals, not anyone." Why not? Elias considered this with the seriousness he gave all questions. "Because he's never wrong about people," he said finally. "He reads them exactly, every time, and he uses what he reads with complete precision. People are afraid of violence. Roman Castellano makes people afraid of being known." Seraphina said nothing, but she filed it. 9 months later, through a sequence of professional referrals that she would later understand had been less accidental than they appeared, she was sitting in a room on the 41st floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, across a desk from the man himself. Roman Castellano was not what rumor constructed. She had assembled an image from Elias's description and the controlled near-nothing that appeared in press coverage, something operatic, something overwhelming. What she found instead was a man in his early 40s with the posture of someone who had never needed to perform authority, because authority had long since stopped being a performance. Dark-eyed, still in the way of things that don't need to move to demonstrate power. There was a quality of attention about him that was almost uncomfortable, not hostile, but complete. The kind of attention that made you aware of every unnecessary word before you spoke it. He'd heard about her through the asset recovery work. He had a specific problem, a network of financial instruments connected to individuals he needed to identify and isolate. And he'd been told she was the most precise reader of financial architecture currently working outside a federal building. Their first meeting lasted 90 minutes. She explained her methodology. He asked 4 questions, each one cutting exactly to the structural issue she'd been most careful about, each one demonstrating that he'd understood her presentation in full before she'd finished delivering it. She took the work. The professional arrangement evolved over months, through a dozen projects, through the slow accumulation of demonstrated trust, through conversations that began as operational briefings and extended, occasionally, into other territory. She learned his history in pieces he didn't offer voluntarily, but didn't withhold when she asked directly. The father killed when Roman was 11 by a rival syndicate, the older half-brother who took over at 17 and ran operations with a brutality Roman had eventually and bloodily corrected, the decade of methodical construction that had produced the empire his competitors feared and his allies depended on. He was not a good man. She was clear-eyed about this. He operated in markets that required violence as a cost of business, and he did not pretend otherwise, and she respected the honesty of that pretense even as she understood what it meant. But there was something underneath the structure of him, something careful and almost private, a quality of care he showed in unexpected places, in the precision with which he kept his word, in the way he listened to people most powerful men wouldn't bother registering, in the particular tiredness in his eyes when the operational conversations ended and the room went quiet. She was not naive about what she felt. She cataloged it with the same analytical rigor she brought to everything, examined it for distortion, for the particular vulnerability of women who'd been diminished and then encountered men who treated them as capable. She was not going to make the same mistake twice in the same direction. But the feeling persisted, accurate and inconvenient. 6 months before the night of the Astor Grand Gala, Roman had looked at her across a table covered in financial documents and said, with the directness that was his only register, "I want to marry you, not for cover, not for access. I want you with me in a way that changes what both of us are." She'd looked at him for a long time. "You understand what you're asking me to be part of," she said. "Yes. And you understand who I was before I became someone useful to you." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, exactly, but opened slightly, like a door moved by wind. "I know who you were," he said. "I'm asking because of who you are now, and who I think you're going to become." She said yes on a Tuesday. The ring he gave her was not his grandmother's. The night of the Astor Grand Gala arrived with a cold front that swept in off the Atlantic and turned the air brittle and bright. The event was a charity function, the kind that served as cover for serious conversations among people whose serious conversations required neutral ground, and Roman had received an invitation that was both genuine and understood to be a statement of access. His attendance was a declaration. His attendance with a wife was something more specific. Seraphina knew this when she dressed. She wore the silver gown not because she was told to, but because she understood, with the precision she brought to everything now, what it would communicate. The woman Damien had discarded as too soft, as ill-equipped for this world, would appear not in armor, but in something fluid and devastating, something that said, "I was never soft, you simply never made me necessary." The car arrived at 8. Roman stood in the lobby of their building. He'd moved from the Midtown office to a townhouse on the Upper West Side that contained, among other things, more books than any building Seraphina had previously inhabited. Adjusting his jacket with the unhurried efficiency of a man who never rushed because rushing implied vulnerability to time. He looked at her when she descended the stairs, not the look of a man assessing presentation, something quieter than that. "Ready?" he said. "Since about 3 years ago," she answered. The car moved through the cold city, and Seraphina sat with her hands in her lap and felt the particular quality of the evening, its weight, its imminence, settle over her like a second garment. She knew Damien would be there. She'd confirmed this through channels she wouldn't name to anyone. She wasn't going for him. She understood the difference clearly, had examined it carefully. She wasn't going to wound him. She was going to be seen. Those were not the same thing. And the distinction mattered because one was revenge and the other was simply living. The ballroom of the Astor Grand received them with the full theater of its discomfort. She felt the room change when they entered. Not in the dramatic way of stories. No sudden silence, no dropped glasses. It was subtler and more accurate than that. A frequency shift, a collective recalibration, 300 people simultaneously adjusting their internal assessments of their own positions relative to the two people who had just walked through the door. Power moved through rooms like weather. She'd learned to read it. Roman guided her forward with one hand barely at her back. Barely, but present. A touch that communicated ownership without requiring performance. And Seraphina moved through the crowd with the stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove to any room. She saw Damien at 12 minutes past 9. He was near the bar, holding champagne, talking to a man she recognized distantly as being in commercial real estate. He hadn't seen her yet. She had the advantage of those few seconds. Enough time to observe him as a stranger might, to see him without the distortion of history. He looked prosperous. He looked comfortable. He had the appearance of a man whose life was proceeding according to his own satisfactory design. Then he turned, and she watched it happen in his face. The recognition, the revision of all assumptions, the rapid, involuntary reconstruction of an evening he'd believed he understood. The champagne glass tilted slightly in his hand. He caught it. A small correction. But she saw it. Roman noticed her noticing. He said nothing. He moved them toward the center of the room, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, engaged with brief precision in 3 conversations that were really intelligence exchanges dressed in social clothing, and kept Seraphina close with the particular attentiveness of a man who understood that this evening was hers in a way that had nothing to do with him. By the time Damien found his way to the balcony, she was already there. She'd chosen it. Stepped away from Roman briefly. They'd exchanged a look. She'd tilted her chin slightly toward the terrace doors. He'd understood immediately and moved into conversation with a state senator and walked out into the cold air overlooking Manhattan with her glass in her hand and her heartbeat perfectly steady. Damien appeared behind her 4 minutes later. She heard his footsteps on the stone terrace. She didn't turn. 3 years, he said. His voice was careful, but she could hear the thing underneath it. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something more complicated. The particular register of a man who's had to revise a story he told himself about someone who didn't matter. 3 years, she agreed. You disappeared without a word. No forwarding address. Your phone was disconnected. A pause. I tried to reach you. I know. She had known. She'd received the legal correspondence through Clara Renwick and let the rest translate into silence. I didn't want to be reached. And now you show up here. His voice had an edge now, not threatened, but assembling itself toward threat, testing the territory. Married to a criminal. She turned then, looked at him with the fullness of 3 years' worth of constructed perspective, with everything she'd built in the space he'd vacated. He looked the same. That was the thing about people who'd wounded you. They persisted in appearing the same, as though injury should leave evidence on the one who inflicted it. No, she said, I came back successful. There's a difference. He started to say something. She saw it forming, saw the shape of whatever rationalization or accusation or wounded self-justification he'd been carrying into this conversation. And then the air on the balcony changed. Roman stepped out from the terrace door. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. He simply appeared at Seraphina's peripheral vision, and the whole geometry of the balcony reorganized around the fact of him. His stillness, his presence, the quality of attention he brought that made every other person in a space feel precisely observed. He looked at Damien with an expression of complete, unhurried neutrality. Then he adjusted his cufflink. You're standing too close to my wife, he said. The sentence contained no elevation, no particular emphasis. It was the flattest possible delivery of a statement that everyone present understood as final. Damien stepped back, one step, then another. Seraphina watched him and felt nothing she'd expected to feel. No satisfaction, no triumph, nothing operatic. What she felt was closer to the sensation of completing a proof, the small, clean recognition of a thing resolved, a circle closed, an account that had reached its final line. Roman looked at her, a question in it. She gave him the smallest nod. They walked back inside together, into the light and the noise and the ongoing theater of power, and Seraphina held her glass and let the evening continue around her, and understood, somewhere in the deep structure of herself, that something had just ended, and that what was coming next would be larger and more dangerous than anything she'd yet survived. She didn't know yet about the ledger. She didn't know yet what Damien Cross had really wanted when he married her. She didn't know yet that the worst betrayal wasn't personal. It never had been. She was smiling when Roman leaned close and said quietly, beneath the noise of the room, "He's afraid of you." "Good," she said. And somewhere in the lower levels of the city, in a vault, in an office building Seraphina had walked past 100 times without understanding what it contained, a ledger sat in the dark, waiting to be found. It held her father's name. It held everything. The ledger didn't announce itself. That was the thing about the most destructive objects in the world. They sat quietly in ordinary places, patient as geology, waiting for the exact person who would know what they were looking at. A folder in a drawer, a name in a column, the number that doesn't reconcile. Seraphina had spent 3 years learning to read the hidden architecture of financial deception, learning to find the load-bearing lie in any structure, and she had done it for clients she'd never met about money. She had no personal stake in, and she had been excellent at it in the detached, methodical way of a surgeon who operates without flinching, because flinching is not the point. She had not expected to one day find her father's name, but that came later. First came the weeks after the gala, which were not triumphant in the way that confrontations in ballrooms are supposed to feel triumphant. Seraphina returned to the townhouse on the Upper West Side that night and sat on the edge of the bed in her silver gown and felt the adrenaline of the evening exit her body in slow, methodical stages, leaving behind something raw and less legible. Roman brought her a glass of water without being asked. He sat in the chair across from her. He didn't speak immediately, which was one of the things about him she had come to depend on, his ability to occupy silence without filling it with himself. "He looked smaller," she said finally. "He is smaller." "He didn't used to seem it." Roman looked at her steadily. "People look larger when they have access to something you need. When you stop needing it, the distortion corrects." She turned the glass in her hands. "Is that experience or theory?" "Experience," he said. "Always experience." She thought about asking which specific experience. She didn't. There were territories in Roman Castellano that she navigated with care, not because he'd asked her to, but because she respected the architecture of a person who had survived by controlling what was known about them. She offered him the same discipline she demanded for herself. She changed out of the gown. She slept badly and woke early and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window watching the city resume itself in the gray preliminary light. And she thought about Damien stepping back on that balcony, and the necklace around Vivian's throat, and her father's last year alive, the confusion he'd shown in his final months, the financial stress he'd tried to conceal from her, the way he'd died owing more than his estate could cover, which had surprised everyone who'd known him because he'd been careful with money his entire life. She'd accepted it at the time, accepted it the way grief accepts inexplicable things, filing them under the large general category of life being random and loss being unaccountable. She hadn't asked questions because asking questions required a functioning mind, and her mind had not been functioning at the level required during the year her father died and the year she married Damien, events that had happened in a proximity she had never before interrogated. She set down her coffee. She picked up her phone. The asset recovery firm she'd left 18 months ago was called Crestline Advisory, and her former colleague there, a man named Thomas Varga, who had the posture of someone who'd spent 2 decades looking at things people wished he wouldn't, answered her call on the third ring with the particular wariness of someone who understood that calls from Seraphina Vale at 6:40 in the morning were not casual. "I need a favor," she said. "Define favor." "Historical financial trace. Private estate. Liquidated about 5 years ago. I want to know where the debt originated and who held it." A pause. She could hear him breathing through his nose, that specific sound he made when he was deciding whether to engage with something that had the shape of something complicated. Whose estate? My father's. The pause this time was different, longer. Seraphina. Don't, she said. Don't do the thing where you make it about my emotional state. I'm asking you a professional question. Your emotional state is a professional concern when it affects your judgment. My judgment is exactly what's operating here. That's why I'm calling someone I trust instead of pulling it myself. She moved away from the window, set down her mug. I need primary documentation, estate filings, creditor records, the chain on the debt instruments, anything that shows where the liquidity problem actually originated. Another pause. How fast? As fast as you can move without flagging it. 3 days, Tomas said. Maybe 4. 3, she said, and ended the call. Roman had a meeting that morning with 3 men whose names did not appear on any organizational chart. Men who handled the operational logistics of the empire's more definitively illegal components. Men who were loyal because Roman had made loyalty the most rational available choice, which was different from loyalty based on fear and considerably more durable. Seraphina had met 2 of them. They regarded her with the specific assessment of people who understood she'd been vetted by someone they trusted completely, and were therefore neither hostile nor warm, simply watchful. She worked from the townhouse study, which Roman had cleared for her use in the early months of their arrangement, and which she'd gradually populated with the evidence of her methodology. 3 monitors, a networked printer, a whiteboard along the east wall where she mapped the financial structures she was currently analyzing. The board now showed 3 separate networks of holding companies and shell entities connected to a private equity firm called Varan Capital that Roman's intelligence had identified as a money conduit for 2 competing crime families. She stared at the board for a long time without seeing it. Then she opened a separate window on the left monitor and began pulling what public records existed on her father's estate. What she found took 4 hours and produced nothing definitive, which itself was information. The estate records were clean in the way that things are clean when someone has been careful. Not absent, but carefully minimal, the kind of minimalism that requires active effort. The debt that had liquidated her father's assets was attributed to a series of investment positions that had underperformed. The positions were recorded. The vehicles were named. But the originating institution, the entity that had extended the instruments in the first place, was referenced obliquely, redirecting through a numbered holding company that Seraphina could not immediately trace. She wrote the holding company number on a notepad. She looked at it. She knew that handwriting, not literally, not the specific number, but she knew the structure. She had seen holding companies formatted in that particular registry pattern before, in work she'd done for Roman 18 months ago, in a network of financial vehicles connected to... She stopped the thought. She needed Tomas's documentation. She closed the window and went back to the Varan analysis, and worked until noon with the surface of her attention, while the deeper current of her mind ran the other question continuously, testing it, looking for the place where her pattern recognition was producing coincidence rather than structure. She couldn't find that place. Roman returned at 2 in the afternoon. He came directly to the study, paused in the doorway with his jacket over one arm, reading her posture with the accuracy she'd long since stopped being startled by. "What happened?" he said. "I'm looking at something." "What kind of something?" She turned in the chair, looked at him, decided. "My father's estate had a liquidity crisis in the last year of his life that I accepted without examining. I'm examining it now." Roman was still for a moment. Then he moved into the room, set his jacket over the back of a chair, and looked at the notepad on her desk. He looked at the holding company number without touching it. "Where did you pull this?" "Public estate filings." He straightened. His expression had shifted into something she recognized as his operational register, the same quality of attention he brought to threat assessment, to the reading of situations that required immediate and accurate analysis. "I've seen this registry pattern," he said. "I know." They looked at each other. "Say it," he said. "I don't have enough yet to say it accurately." "Say what you think." She turned back to the monitor. "I think my father's financial collapse wasn't random. I think the debt instruments were manufactured and created specifically to liquidate his estate at a particular moment. I think whoever held the originating position knew exactly what assets would become accessible when the estate dissolved. She stopped, drew a breath. And I think I married the heir to that position 8 months after my father died. The room was very quiet. Roman pulled out the other chair and sat, not across from her, beside her, facing the same direction, looking at the same screens. This was something she'd noticed early in their working relationship. When the situation was serious, he sat beside rather than across. Across was for negotiations, beside was for war planning. You need the originating documentation, he said. Tomas is pulling it. Tomas Varga? Yes. 3 days is too long. He took out his phone. I have someone faster. Roman, this isn't about managing your emotional process, Seraphina. If you're right, then Damien Cross targeted you with premeditation, and your father's death was not incidental to that plan. His voice was flat and completely controlled. That changes what we're dealing with. She wanted to argue. She looked at the screen instead. Make the call, she said. The documentation arrived in 16 hours. It arrived via a courier who appeared at the townhouse door at 6:45 the following morning, carrying a sealed envelope that he handed to Roman's head of security, a man named Garrett, who was built like a doorframe and communicated largely through the positioning of his eyebrows. The envelope contained a USB drive and a single printed page that was a chain of custody certification from a legal archive in Delaware. Seraphina sat at the study desk and opened the drive's contents and spent 90 minutes reading. When she was done, she sat with her hands flat on the desk and breathed through her nose, slowly, because the alternative was something she refused to give the room. Roman was on the phone in the hallway. She could hear the murmur of his voice, quiet, clipped, the surgical efficiency of his operational cadence. She waited until it stopped, and then she said at a level she calculated would carry through the half-open door, "Come in here." He appeared in the doorway. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "My father controlled 3 accounts," she began. Her voice was steady because she needed it to be, and she was capable of requiring things from herself and receiving them. Inherited accounts, old family assets, mostly in the form of encrypted private instruments, set up by my grandfather in the 90s through a private bank in the Cayman Islands. The access protocols were biometric. They required living authorization from a designated heir. She paused. When my father died, I became the designated heir. The accounts required my biometric authorization to liquidate or transfer. Roman said nothing. I provided that authorization during the first year of my marriage. She looked at her hands. Damien told me it was an estate formality, that the accounts had to be formally transferred into joint instruments for the marriage to be legally complete under the jurisdiction of the original banking agreement. He had an attorney explain it. He had documentation. Her jaw tightened. I signed. I pressed my thumb to a reader. I looked into a camera for the biometric registration. I did it in a lawyer's office in Midtown Manhattan on a Tuesday morning, and then Damien took me to lunch at a restaurant where he'd reserved a corner table and ordered champagne and told me we were building something permanent together. The room was silent. The accounts contained encrypted access to approximately $240 million in assets that my grandfather had structured specifically to survive scrutiny, specifically to be untraceable to conventional audit. She stopped, breathed. They were used, Roman, while I was still married to him, while I was still in that apartment, to fund operations that the documentation describes as luxury investment vehicles. She turned to look at him. His expression had not changed in the way most people's expressions changed when confronted with information that was operational and significant. It had tightened instead, inward, concentrated, the way a fist closes. Investment vehicles, she said. I heard you. That's the language Damien's attorneys used to structure the payments. Luxury investment vehicles. Acquisition of human assets for temporary lease agreements. She pushed back from the desk. Human trafficking, Roman. My inheritance, my grandfather's money, my father's legacy, was laundered through $240 million worth of trafficking operations, and I signed the authorization that made it possible. And I did it in the first year of my marriage because I trusted a man who had targeted me specifically because of what I had access to. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them as though they belonged to someone she was responsible for, with something adjacent to clinical concern, as if the shaking were a symptom to be assessed rather than a response to be experienced. Roman stood too. Seraphina. Don't. Her voice cracked on the single syllable, and she held it there, held the crack still, refused to let it widen. Don't handle me right now, I need 30 seconds. He stopped. She walked to the window. She looked at the street below. The ordinary morning motion of people and cars, and the city proceeding in its complete indifference to the information that had just reorganized everything she understood about the last 5 years of her life. Her father's confusion in his final months. The financial stress he'd tried to hide. He had known something was wrong with the accounts, had probably understood, in the imprecise way of a man encountering sophisticated financial manipulation for the first time, that something was being done to the assets he was supposed to protect, without being able to name precisely what or who. He had died with that confusion unresolved. He had died, she now understood, before he could ask her the right questions. 30 seconds. She turned back. I want to destroy him, she said. What followed required a conversation that lasted 4 hours and covered ground that was not comfortable for either of them. Roman had structures in place, had always had structures in place, but deploying them against Damien Cross was not the same as deploying them against rival syndicate operations. Damien occupied a position that touched legitimate financial power, political relationships, law enforcement adjacency. Moving against him required precision that left no room for reaction, and it required a specific kind of intelligence that Roman's operational apparatus was not fully equipped to generate alone. He needed her, not as a wife. As the analyst who'd spent 3 years learning to read the hidden architecture of financial deception. As the person who understood from the inside exactly how Damien's instruments were structured, because she'd watched their construction while believing she was witnessing something else. You know where the bodies are buried, Roman said without particular metaphor. I know where the accounting is buried, she said. In his world, those are the same thing. What do you need? She pulled the whiteboard forward, erased the Varenne capital analysis without ceremony, picked up a marker. I need access to his internal servers, she said, writing as she spoke. Not the public-facing infrastructure, the internal systems, the ones his compliance attorneys don't touch. I need someone who can physically access the hardware, which means someone inside his building's maintenance infrastructure. She paused. And I need whatever you have on his personal security team, because at least one of them is going to notice what I'm doing before I'm done with it. Roman was already on his phone. She worked. The problem with building something designed to bring down a man like Damien Cross was that Damien Cross had not become Damien Cross by being careless. He was careful in the systematic way of someone who had always understood that his operations required insulation, who had structured his empire with enough legal legitimacy layered over its core illegality that conventional investigation kept sliding off the surface of it. He had federal relationships. He had a law firm with 400 attorneys and 3 practice groups dedicated exclusively to regulatory defense. He had a public profile that was useful, the philanthropist, the civic leader, the man whose face appeared beside senators at fundraising dinners, and he had been building that profile since before Seraphina met him, specifically because it was the most effective available inoculation against accountability. He had one vulnerability. Seraphina knew it because she'd lived inside it for 4 years. Damien trusted his own assessment of people absolutely. He had an accurate instinct for threat. He had, in her experience, never been significantly wrong about someone's capacity to damage him, except once. He'd looked at Seraphina Vale and seen softness, had seen a woman whose utility was access and whose temperament was management and who would cause him no trouble when managed correctly. He'd been wrong, and the architecture of his confidence in that assessment was still standing. He didn't know what she knew. He didn't know about Tomas. He didn't know about the Delaware archive. He didn't know that she'd spent 3 years becoming precisely the person required to find the load-bearing lie in his entire structure. She intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as she needed. 3 days after she'd written "destroy him" on the whiteboard, Seraphina received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered because Roman's intelligence had flagged the number 40 minutes earlier as connected to a burner phone purchased in cash from a pharmacy in Midtown. "You've been asking questions," said the voice on the line. Male. Calibrated. Someone who'd been told what to say and was delivering it without inflection. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone with a message." A pause. "Mr. Cross is aware you've been making inquiries. He wants you to understand that certain documents you may be looking for don't exist in any form that will be useful to you. Tell Mr. Cross he should have married someone stupid," she said, and ended the call. She set the phone down on the desk. She looked at it. Her pulse was elevated. She could feel it in her throat and in her fingertips, and in the specific heightened clarity of attention that adrenaline produced, the world briefly rendered in sharper definition. He knew, not everything. If he knew everything, the call would not have been delivered by an intermediary with a vague threat. He would have moved operationally immediately, with the decisiveness she remembered from 4 years of watching him handle threats to his interests. The call meant he knew she was looking, but he didn't yet know what she'd found. He was testing whether she'd be deterred. She was not going to be deterred. She went to find Roman. He was in the kitchen. An incongruous detail, Roman Castellano standing at a counter eating toast over a sink, and he turned when she came in, and he read her face, and he set the toast down. "He made contact," she said. Roman was still. "Intermediary. Burner phone. He knows I'm pulling documentation, but he doesn't know what I have yet." Roman picked up his phone, made a call, said 3 sentences to whoever answered, ended it. "He just closed the window," he said. "What window?" "The window in which this moves slowly." His voice had a quality she'd heard before in the final stages of operational escalation. Not anger, but the temperature of absolute resolution, the sound of a decision that had been made and required nothing further. "Now it moves fast." Seraphina looked at him. "How fast?" "Fast enough that you need to tell me right now everything you know about where his primary documentation is physically held. Not digitally, physically." She thought about the 4 years of watching Damien move through his world, the habits, the paranoia he disguised as organization. The vault she'd seen once, briefly, during the first year of their marriage, a room within a room in the private office he maintained in his personal residence, the one his security team swept twice a day, the one that required a code she'd never been given and never asked for. She'd cataloged it then, without knowing she was doing it. She described it now with complete precision. And as she spoke, as the information left her mouth and became operational, became the foundation of what would happen next, she understood with total clarity that she had just stepped through a door that did not operate in reverse. Whatever she had been before this moment, she was something else now. And Damien Cross, in his Midtown office, receiving the report that his message had been delivered, had absolutely no idea what was already moving toward him. He had made the same mistake twice with the same woman. He would not get a third. The raid happened on a Wednesday. Roman's men moved on Damien's secondary warehouse facility in Red Hook at 2:40 in the morning, a converted cold storage building that sat at the end of a service road behind a legitimate import company, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building that existed in that part of Brooklyn in such numbers that no one looked at it twice. Garrett had coordinated the entry team personally. 6 men, trained to a standard that made federal tactical units look procedural by comparison, moving through a building they'd mapped from stolen architectural files and a thermal scan conducted 3 nights prior. Seraphina was not there. She was in the study, watching the operation through a live audio feed on the left monitor, and working through Damien's financial architecture on the right, pulling threads she'd identified in the Delaware documentation, and following them forward through time, through shell companies and nominee directors, and the elaborate legal scaffolding of a man who had spent a decade making his money untouchable. The work required a specific kind of sustained attention, the kind that kept the emotional content of what she was doing quarantined to a separate compartment, accessible but not running in the foreground, because if she let herself think about her father while she was reading the instruments she was reading, the efficiency would collapse entirely. She kept the compartment locked. She worked. At 3:17, Garrett's voice came through the audio feed. "Package confirmed. Moving out." The package was a server unit, a specific piece of hardware that Damien's IT architect had installed 18 months ago, and which, according to the source Roman's intelligence had flipped inside Damien's organization, contained unencrypted backups of internal communications that his primary servers purged on a rolling 30-day cycle. The backups existed because Damien was paranoid about data loss. The paranoia that was supposed to protect him was going to destroy him. Seraphina had identified this vulnerability 3 days ago. It had taken Roman's people 72 hours to confirm, plan, and execute. She exhaled when Garrett confirmed the extraction. Then she went back to the financial threads. The server unit arrived at the townhouse by 4:30. A man named Chen, quiet, 50s, who Roman described only as someone who understood systems, began extraction immediately in a room on the second floor that had been cleared and equipped for exactly this purpose. Seraphina stayed in the study. She could hear distantly the sound of hardware being connected, the particular sequence of electronic sounds that preceded serious work. Roman appeared in the doorway at 5. "Red Hook is clean," he said. "No casualties, no contact with Damien's security. He'll know by morning." "He'll know by 6, Roman said. "He has a monitoring system. Garrett triggered it on exit intentionally." She turned. "Why?" "Because I want him moving. People moving fast make mistakes." He came into the room, stood behind her left shoulder, looked at the screen. "What are you finding?" The trafficking operations were structured through 7 distinct holding vehicles across 4 jurisdictions. The money moved in a pattern, always the same sequence, always the same interval between transfers, which means whoever designed the system valued consistency over obscurity. She pointed at the screen. "That's a vulnerability. Consistency leaves pattern evidence. I have 4 years of transfer data, and I can reconstruct the full operational timeline." "How long?" "With Chen's extraction from the server? 2 days. Maybe less." Roman straightened. "You should sleep." "I slept 3 hours." "Seraphina." "Roman." She said it with the same flatness he used, and he received it the same way he always received her direct register. Not as challenge, but as information, as her telling him clearly what was true. "When I'm done with this, I will sleep. Right now, I need the pattern." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not quite worry and not quite pride, but occupied the territory between them. "I'll have coffee sent up," he said, and left. Chen delivered the first extraction report at 7:48 in the morning. Seraphina was on her 3rd coffee and had filled 6 pages of a yellow legal pad with handwritten notations. She took the extraction report and read it standing up at the desk, still in yesterday's clothes, and she was 4 pages in when she found the first anomaly. It was a communication thread. Internal, between 2 addresses that the server's directory attributed to usernames she didn't recognize. The thread dated back 14 months. The content was operational, logistics, schedules, asset movement reports, and it was structured in the same coded language she'd seen in the financial instruments. Everything euphemized, everything one step removed from its literal meaning. But the anomaly wasn't in the language, it was in the metadata. She sat down very slowly. The communication thread's metadata showed a ping location for one of the 2 addresses. The server had logged it automatically, a routine function that Damien's IT architect had apparently failed to disable. The location was consistent across every entry in the thread, across 14 months of communication. It was the asset recovery firm, Crestline Advisory, Tomas Varga's office. She sat with this information for what was probably 30 seconds, and felt it move through her the way cold water moves, not fast, but comprehensive, reaching every part of her simultaneously, leaving nothing untouched. Tomas, who'd answered her call at 6:40 in the morning with the wariness of someone who understood that calls from Seraphina Vale were not casual. Who'd asked whose estate with a pause that she'd read as concern and which she now reread entirely. Who'd said 3 days and whom she'd pushed to 3 without understanding that the timeline she was compressing was the timeline he needed to warn someone. She picked up her phone. She called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She stood up. She walked to the door. "Roman, Alman," she said, at a level that carried. He was there in under 30 seconds. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, unhurried but immediate. The particular cadence of a man who'd trained himself to respond to that tone without running because running communicated something he refused to communicate. He appeared in the doorway. She turned the laptop so he could see the screen. He looked at the metadata. He looked at the address. He looked at her. "Tomas Varga," she said. Roman's expression did not change in the way most people's expressions changed. It compressed. You trusted him. I did. How much does he know? She thought about the call. Everything she'd said. Historical financial trace. Private estate liquidated about 5 years ago. My father's. She thought about the confidence with which she'd proceeded. The particular blindness of trusting someone who'd been useful for 3 years. The way competence-based trust was its own vulnerability because it evaluated the wrong variable. Enough, she said. He knows I have the Delaware documentation. He knows I'm looking at my father's estate. He knows I'm operating from... She stopped. From where? Roman said. I called him from my personal phone, she said. From here. The room went completely still. Roman turned and walked out. She heard his voice in the hallway. 3 sentences, clipped, operational, the sound of machinery engaging. She heard Garrett's voice responding. She heard the front door. She turned back to the screen and kept reading. What she found in the next 4 hours reconstructed the world. Tomas Varga had been on Damien's payroll for 2 years, since 8 months after Seraphina left Crestline Advisory, since a period when her departure had apparently prompted Damien to assess what exposure she represented and to install a monitoring mechanism inside the firm she'd trusted most. The communication thread showed the full sequence. Damien had identified Tomas as financially vulnerable after a bad divorce and 2 years of declining billings, had approached him through an intermediary, had offered a retainer that Tomas had accepted without, as far as Seraphina could read, excessive deliberation. Tomas hadn't been watching her specifically. He'd been watching for her, waiting, on standing instruction, for the possibility that she might resurface and start asking questions. For 2 years, he'd been a dormant asset. Her call at 6:40 in the morning had activated him immediately. The Delaware documentation she'd asked him to pull, she now understood that he hadn't pulled it. He'd told Damien she was looking for it, which had prompted Damien's people to move before she could access the real archive. What Chen had extracted from the Red Hook server showed a data operation conducted 40 hours ago, a scrubbing of the Delaware archive's publicly accessible records, a legal maneuver that had removed the specific chain of custody documents she needed before they could reach her. The envelope that arrived via courier at 6:45 in the morning. She'd handed it to Garrett. She'd opened it. She'd spent 90 minutes reading it and had built everything. Her entire reconstruction, the timeline of Damien's manipulation of her father's estate, the authorization she'd unknowingly provided, on documents she had not yet verified as authentic. She opened the Delaware archive herself now, directly, with the access protocols she'd kept from her Crestline years. She navigated to the specific chain of custody records she needed, the records that the courier's documentation had referenced, the chain that had supposedly confirmed the originating institution's connection to Damien's holding company. Gone. Not redacted, not blocked. Gone. In the specific way of things that have been retroactively removed from archives by people with sufficient legal and financial resources to make courts cooperate. There was a placeholder, a procedural notation indicating the records had been transferred to a private legal hold, and a jurisdiction notice that would require 6 months of litigation to challenge. She sat back. The documents she had were real. She believed this. They'd been constructed from actual data. Data that Damien's people had presumably not known she possessed through the other channels she'd used, the channels that didn't run through Tomas. But without the chain of custody documentation from Delaware, without the originating institution records, what she had was a pattern, suggestive, detailed, internally consistent, and legally insufficient. Without the chain, she had analysis. She did not have evidence. Damien had not destroyed the documentation. He'd simply moved it somewhere she couldn't reach it from here. And now he knew exactly where she was working from. Roman came back at noon. He came back alone, which told her before he spoke that whatever he'd sent Garrett to do had not fully resolved. He sat in the chair across from the desk, across, not beside, which told her the next thing, and he looked at her with the expression he reserved for operational situations that had degraded. Varga is gone, he said. Left his apartment sometime before 8 this morning. His car is at JFK. Damien moved him. Presumably. Did Garrett... No, Roman said. He was already on a plane. She nodded. The townhouse address, Roman said. We have to assume Damien has it. Yes. We need to move. I know. Seraphina. He leaned forward, put his forearms on the desk, brought his face into her direct line of sight. He didn't touch her. He rarely initiated physical contact, not from coldness, but from a precision about when touch was useful. Talk to me. She looked at him. She was aware of her own face, aware of what it was doing, aware of the effort it was taking to maintain the compartment structure she'd been running since 2 in the morning. The compartment labeled father was the problem. The compartment labeled 4 years was the problem. The compartment labeled I was used as an instrument by a man who calculated the value of my access before he calculated the value of my trust was the problem. All of these compartments were sealed and all of them were under pressure, and the information she'd spent 4 hours reading was the pressure source, and she could feel the structural integrity of the whole system straining. The documents Tomas delivered are real, she said. The underlying data is accurate. He gave me authentic documentation because giving me fabricated documentation risked me finding the fabrication, and Damien needed me to believe I had the chain so I'd move on it before I could find alternate verification routes. She paused. What I don't have is the originating institution records. Without those, I cannot prove the causal chain between Damien's holding company and my father's estate. I have circumstantial structure. I have pattern. I don't have proof. What do you need? The physical ledger. She'd been thinking about this since she found the deleted archive records. Damien doesn't trust digital documentation for his most critical records. I know this because I watched him for 4 years. He maintains physical copies of primary instruments in the vault in his private residence, the one I told you about. The vault we've been planning to access for 6 days, Roman said. Yes. The plan we haven't executed yet because we were waiting for the server extraction to give us the security team rotations. Yes. The plan that is now complicated by the fact that Damien knows we took the server and knows approximately where we're operating from. Yes, she said. That plan. Roman stood. He went to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking at the street, and she watched the set of his shoulders and recognized the quality of the stillness. Not uncertainty, but the specific concentration of a man reorganizing variables. He's going to move the ledger, she said. I know. If he moves it before we get into that vault, we lose the physical evidence permanently. I know. Which means the window is tonight, Roman said. He turned. The window is tonight, or it doesn't exist. The room held the weight of this for 3 seconds. Then we go tonight, she said. What came next moved with a speed that compressed time. The hours between noon and 9 in the evening collapsed into a series of preparations that Seraphina processed in the focused, granular way of someone who has decided that the emotional accounting will come later and the work will come now. She changed clothes. She ate something she didn't taste. She sat with Roman and his 3 operational lieutenants around the kitchen table and laid out what she knew about Damien's private residence. The floor plan she'd reconstructed from memory, the vault location, the security panel she'd seen installed 2 months into their marriage when Damien had the building system upgraded, and she'd watched the technicians work without being asked to leave because she was still, in those early months, a person he considered decorative enough to be harmless. She gave them everything. The lieutenants listened without expression. One of them, a man named Reyes, compact and dark-eyed, who Seraphina had found consistently the most precise of Roman's operational people, asked 4 questions, each one cutting directly to the variables she hadn't yet specified. She answered them. He nodded and went back to the floor plan she'd sketched. Roman watched the whole thing without intervening. At 8:15, she went upstairs. She stood in the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists, a habit she'd developed during the Crestline years, during long nights of financial investigation. A physical reset that had nothing to do with anything dramatic and everything to do with keeping the nervous system from pooling heat in the wrong places. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked at the woman looking back, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost impersonal, who are you now? Not the woman in the silver gown, not the analyst at Crestline, not the person who'd stood in a penthouse kitchen folding an apron while her marriage ended 43 floors above the street. Someone newer. Someone harder in the specific places where hardness was required, and softer, maybe, in the specific place where softness was the only accurate response to what she now knew about her father's last year. He had spent that year frightened and confused, watching his finances deteriorate without understanding why, without being able to explain it to the daughter he'd never wanted to burden. He had died not knowing that the man his daughter was about to marry was the reason. He had died not knowing that she would spend 4 years married to that man without understanding, and another 3 years becoming something that man had never expected her to become. She turned off the water. She went back downstairs. They were 40 minutes from departure when Roman's phone went. He looked at the screen. Something moved in his expression, a fast, controlled contraction, there and gone. He answered, listened for 11 seconds, said 2 words, and ended the call. He looked at Seraphina. "Damien isn't at the residence," he said. She felt the bottom of the plan give slightly. "Where is he?" "An event, a private dinner at a club in the East 60s. He left the residence at 7:30. Roman's voice was careful in a way that meant the careful was doing work. "Seraphina, his security team is still at the residence. Then we go while he's out. That was always the better scenario." "His security team is there," Roman said, "and there's a woman there." She looked at him. "Vivienne," he said, "and the child." The room reorganized itself. Seraphina stood very still and felt the plan. The plan she'd built her entire operational strategy around, the plan that was supposed to deliver the physical evidence tonight, or lose it permanently, press against this new information, and deform. Vivienne and the child were not targets. This was not a question she needed to deliberate. Whatever Vivienne was, whatever she knew or didn't know about Damien's operations, she was not part of this, and the child was simply not discussable. Seraphina's mind cleared itself of the plan's original shape and began immediately recalculating, running the new variables, looking for the adjusted route. "Can we get to the vault without accessing the residential floors?" she asked. "The vault is on the residential floor," Reyes said from across the table. "3rd level, same floor as the primary bedroom suite, which is where Vivienne would be, presumably. What time does Damien's dinner end?" Roman looked at his phone, made a call, waited. "The event is scheduled through midnight. 3.5 hours, she said. "If we go in, it has to be clean," Roman said. "Vivienne does not get touched. The child does not get touched. If there is any possibility of contact, we pull back." "Agreed." "Reyes." Roman turned. "Can you put 2 people on the 3rd floor without breaching the residential suite?" Reyes looked at the floor plan sketch. He was quiet for 15 seconds. She watched him work the problem, watched the particular quality of concentration on a man who was very good at what he did and understood that the quality of his answer mattered. "Possible," he said. "Tight. Service corridor accesses the vault anteroom from the east side. If Vivienne is in the main suite and the suite door is closed and we move in the window between the security rotation..." He paused, calculated. 8-minute window, every 45 minutes. "Is that enough?" she asked. "For a standard vault?" He looked at her. "No, for someone who knows the access protocol from the inside." He looked at Roman. "Depends on what she knows." They both looked at Seraphina. She thought about the Tuesday morning in the lawyer's office, the biometric reader, the camera, the access protocol she'd provided without understanding what she was providing. "I know enough," she said. The car that took them toward the east side was quiet, in the way of things moving toward something irreversible. Seraphina sat in the back with Roman beside her and Reyes in the front passenger seat, and the city moved past the windows in its usual brilliant indifference, and she watched it and thought with great precision about her father, and then put him away and thought about the vault and the sequence she'd reconstructed from memory, and then put that away too, and sat in the clean blank space of someone who has done all the thinking available and is waiting for the moment when thinking becomes doing. Roman's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat. He didn't say anything. She turned her palm over and held his hand and looked out the window. They were 6 blocks from the residence when Reyes said, "Problem." She looked up. Through the windshield, at the end of the block that contained Damien's building, 3 vehicles were parked in positions that were wrong. Wrong angles, wrong spacing, the specific wrongness of vehicles positioned for observation rather than residence. "Surveillance?" Roman said. "Federal plates," Reyes said. 2 cars. And he paused, looking at something on his phone. A third registered to a private security firm I've seen before. Who do they work for? Seraphina asked. Reyes looked at his phone for one more second. Then he looked at her. They work for Damien, he said. But the federal plates, those are real. Someone inside Damien's operation is talking to the feds, has been for a while, from the coordination pattern. He paused. And they're not watching the building. Then what are they watching? Roman said. Reyes turned to look directly at Seraphina. They're watching for her, he said. The car stopped. Seraphina looked at the vehicles. She looked at the building. She looked at the 3.5 hours between now and midnight, between now and the moment Damien returned, and whatever was inside that vault either stayed there or disappeared permanently. She looked at the surveillance, federal assets working in coordination with Damien's private security, which meant someone had brokered an arrangement that served both interests simultaneously, which meant Damien had offered something to federal investigators in exchange for something she hadn't yet identified. She thought about what a man like Damien Cross would offer federal investigators in exchange for protection. She thought about it for 4 seconds. He's giving them Roman, she said. The interior of the car was absolutely silent. He's been building a federal case, she said. That's what this is. That's what the private security coordination is. He's been feeding information, building the case, and in exchange she looked at the vehicles. They're watching his building. They're watching for me specifically because if I get into that vault and get the physical ledger, whatever deal he's brokered falls apart. Roman said nothing. She turned to look at him. His face in the car's interior darkness was still and unreadable, and she looked at it and understood that he had not known this, had not known about the federal arrangement, and that the information she'd just spoken was reorganizing things for him in ways she could not fully see from the outside. She understood in this moment, with the completeness of understanding that comes only from paying close attention to someone for a long period of time, that Roman Castellano was genuinely afraid. Not of the federal case, not of Damien, of what the federal case meant for her. Because if the surveillance team had standing instruction to watch for her, and if Roman's connection to her was documented, which it was, had been publicly documented since the Astor Grand Gala, then any move she made toward that building tonight would bring federal attention to bear on both of them simultaneously, and whatever case existed against Roman would gain a participant it currently didn't have. Her. Damien had not simply protected himself. He had constructed a trap that used Roman's empire as the walls, and Seraphina's need for the ledger as the bait. And the ledger, the physical evidence, the only thing that could prove what had been done to her father, the only thing that could put Damien where he belonged, was sitting in a vault on the 3rd floor of a building she could not now enter without walking, into the exact aperture of the trap he'd built for her. The car didn't move. Reyes had his hand on the gear shift and wasn't using it, waiting for a call that hadn't come yet from the 2 people in the back seat. The surveillance vehicles sat at the end of the block like patient machinery. One of the federal cars had its engine running. She could see the exhaust in the cold air, faint and consistent, someone at the wheel who'd been sitting there long enough to need the heat. Roman released her hand. She noticed the precise moment he did it. Not withdrawal, not rejection, but the specific deliberate release of a man separating himself from one mode and entering another. His posture changed marginally. The quality of his attention shifted direction, turned inward to something operational and cold. Drive, he said to Reyes. Reyes drove, past the block, not turning toward the building, continuing east and then south, moving the car into the ordinary flow of the city without urgency. Seraphina watched the surveillance vehicles pass from the rear window. They didn't follow, she said. They don't need to follow, Roman said. They know where you'll go. They think they know. Seraphina. His voice was patient and precise. They have your face, my car registration, and standing federal authorization. They don't need to follow. They need to wait. She turned from the window. How long have you known about the federal case? A pause that was one beat too long. Roman. I've known there was a case building for 14 months, he said. I didn't know Damien was the source. 14 months. She held this. You didn't tell me. It wasn't... You didn't tell me, she said again, not louder but differently. with the weight of a woman who had spent 4 years inside one man's deliberate omissions and recognized the specific texture of being managed. What else don't I know? This isn't the same. What else? Roman looked at her. In the passing light of the street lamps, his face moved in and out of visibility, and she watched it with the full force of the attention she'd spent years cultivating. The attention that found load-bearing lies, that read structure beneath surface, that understood what was being held back by its precise outline. The federal case has a cooperating witness, he said. Someone inside my operation, someone who's been talking for 8 months. The car moved through the city. Who? She said. Roman looked out the window. Roman? Who? I don't know yet, he said. I've been running the identification for 3 weeks. He paused. That's why I didn't tell you. I didn't know who in my organization was compromised, which meant I didn't know who you were safe talking to. She absorbed this. You were protecting me, she said. I was trying to, and by omitting the single piece of information that would have changed my entire operational approach for the last 2 weeks. He said nothing. I called Tomas from this operation, she said. I built a strategy around documentation that may have been partially manipulated. I walked us toward a vault on a street that was already under federal surveillance. She heard her own voice and recognized the quality of it. Not anger exactly, but something cleaner and more dangerous. The sound of a woman recalculating everything from a new baseline. I did all of that without the information I needed because you decided what I should know. Yes, he said. One word. Flat. Not defensive. She looked at him. I was wrong, he said. Just that. She looked at him for 4 more seconds, then she turned to face forward. Pull over, she said to Reyes. Reyes looked at Roman. Roman nodded once. The car stopped on a quiet block in the lower 60s, between a darkened boutique and a parking structure, the kind of block that was thoroughly urban and completely empty at 9:30 on a weeknight. Seraphina got out. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and put her hands in the pockets of her coat and looked up at a thin strip of sky between buildings and thought with great speed and clarity about everything she knew, everything she didn't know, and the 45 minutes remaining until Damien's security team ran their next rotation. The vault was inaccessible from outside. The ledger was going to be moved, probably tonight, probably the moment Damien left his dinner and made the call. Thomas was gone. The Delaware archive was scrubbed. The federal case was active. Roman had a cooperating witness inside his organization whose identity was unknown, which meant any operational move she made through Roman's people carried exposure risk she couldn't quantify. She had the server extraction data. She had the financial pattern analysis. She had 4 years of living inside Damien's world and the specific knowledge of a woman who had watched him build his systems while he believed she was too soft to understand them. She thought about the vault access protocol, the biometric reader, the camera. She thought about the lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. She thought about what Damien had used her for, and what that meant about what he thought she was, and what being that wrong about a person cost a man who'd built his entire architecture on the certainty of his own judgment. She turned around. Roman was standing beside the car. He'd gotten out while she was thinking. He stood with his hands at his sides in the cold, not crowding her, not performing patience, just present, in the way that was simply how he was, available without demand. I need to go in alone, she said. His expression didn't change. No, listen to me. She crossed to him, stood close enough that this was a conversation, not a statement across distance. The federal surveillance is watching for a car registered to your organization, carrying me, approaching the building in a way that reads as a tactical operation. That's what they're watching for. That's the pattern that triggers the response. She paused. One woman, on foot, approaching a building she has legitimate historical connection to, a former residence, where she is listed in the building's security system as a former authorized occupant. You're still in their system? Damien never had me removed, she said. I confirmed it this morning. The building's security team operates on a roster that updates annually. My access code hasn't been cycled. She held his eyes. He was so certain I was gone that he never closed the door. Roman was still. I can get in through the residential entrance, she said. I can move to the 3rd floor through the East Service corridor, the same route Reyes identified. I know the vault anteroom. I know the access sequence. I know the code because I watched him enter it twice, And I have the memory I have, and he never thought to change it because he never thought I'd noticed. She stopped. I can get the ledger and I can get out. One person, no tactical signature, inside the window before the rotation. And if you're wrong about any single variable, Roman said, you're inside a building surrounded by federal assets and Damien's private security, and I am not in a position to get you out. I know. Seraphina. I know, she said again steadily. That's the trade. That's what I'm choosing. He looked at her with the fullness of everything he didn't say, which was considerable. How long? He said. 20 minutes inside, 30 to be safe. I'll have 2 people on the service exit, not entering, positioned outside. If you're not out in 35 minutes, don't come in, she said. If I'm not out in 35 minutes, it means I'm already in federal custody, and you coming in makes it worse for both of us. She held his eyes. Stay out. That's what I need from you. A muscle moved in his jaw. Roman. 35 minutes, he said. Then I make decisions. It wasn't agreement, it was the most she was going to get. She took it. She walked. 4 blocks through the cold, hands in her coat pockets, pace calibrated to belonging. Not fast, not slow, the pace of a person who lived in this neighborhood and was returning to it after an evening out. The air was sharp and tasted of exhaust and something metallic that might have been approaching rain. Her heartbeat was elevated, and she was aware of it without attending to it, the way a runner is aware of breathing without letting awareness become interference. She passed the surveillance vehicles at the corner without looking at them. Not the careful not looking of someone suppressing the instinct. The genuine not looking of a woman who belonged on this street and had somewhere to be, and whose attention was on the door 20 meters ahead. She used her code at the residential entrance. The panel read it for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that she felt the full length of, each of them very long. And then the lock released with the solid sound of a mechanism that had no suspicion of her whatsoever. She was inside. The building's interior was the same. She registered this with the strange doubling of a person re-entering a space where they once lived. The same lobby tile, the same particular smell of climate-controlled air, and the faint underlying scent of the fresh flowers the building management replaced every 3 days. The same elevator with the same brass fixtures. The same quiet that meant the building was the kind of building where noise was managed as a feature of the address. She didn't take the elevator. She found the service corridor entry at the north end of the lobby, used a secondary access code she remembered from the building's maintenance documentation. She'd had to review it once during the marriage when a contractor needed after-hours access, and moved into the back stairwell. 3rd floor. She climbed. At the 3rd floor landing, she paused, pressed her back to the wall beside the door, and listened. On the other side, carpet-muffled quiet, the distant sound of a television, low, probably a bedroom, and closer, at variable intervals, the sound of footsteps that moved in a pattern. Security rotation. She tracked it, counted. The footsteps moved away, turned a corner, continued. She counted to 8 and opened the door. The east corridor of the 3rd floor was exactly as she remembered, narrower than the west-facing residential corridor, service-oriented, the kind of architectural space that existed in buildings like this one to make the operation of luxury invisible to its occupants. She moved along it with her shoulder nearly brushing the wall, keeping her footfalls on the runner carpet that muffled sound, counting doors. The vault anteroom was the 3rd door on the right. She reached it, tried the handle. Locked. This she'd expected. She removed a slim tool from her coat's interior pocket, the kind of tool that was entirely illegal to possess, and that Roman's people had pressed into her hand 40 minutes ago without either of them commenting on what it represented about who she was now. She worked the lock with the focused economy of someone who had practiced this exact motion enough times to know which variables mattered. 11 seconds. The door opened. You get. The anteroom was small, barely 4 meters by 3, containing a secondary security panel, 2 filing cabinets, and the vault door, which was a serious piece of engineering set into the wall beside the cabinets. The room smelled of metal and the dry, neutral air of a space that was temperature-controlled independently from the rest of the floor. She went to the security panel first. It was a model she recognized. Damien had put the same brand in his corporate office during the first year of their marriage, and she'd watched the installer run the setup, and she knew that this specific firmware version had a 30-second grace window between primary authentication failure and lockout engagement. She would not fail primary authentication, but she needed to know the grace window existed. She raised her hand to the biometric reader, pressed her thumb. The system thought. She counted the seconds in her head, 1, 2, 3, 4, and understood somewhere in her nervous system that if she was wrong about still being in the system, if Damien had removed her biometrics at any point in the last 3 years, the next sound would be an alarm, and the next 3 minutes would be the worst 3 minutes she'd had since she stopped having any reason to track worse minutes. The panel beeped once. Access granted. The vault door released with a solid mechanical exhale and swung 2 inches outward, waiting. She pulled it open. The vault's interior was lit by automatic LEDs that activated with the door. Approximately 2 meters deep, lined on 3 sides with locked document drawers and a single open shelf containing several items of value that she didn't look at. On the shelf directly in front of her, in a black leather binder that was exactly where Damien kept the things he used most frequently. Within reach, immediately accessible, because men like Damien did not bury the things they reached for regularly, sat a ledger. She took it. She opened it to the middle. The handwriting was Damien's. She recognized it with the particular visceral accuracy of someone who'd seen it on thousands of casual documents, on grocery lists and birthday cards and the margin notes he made in books. Small, controlled, slanting slightly right, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught precision. The entries were dated. They were in his coding language, the same euphemistic structure she'd seen in the server communications, but she could read them. She'd spent 3 years learning to read this exact kind of notation. Her father's name was on page 7. Not coded. His full name. The account numbers. The date of the authorization transfer. The value. She stood in the vault and read her father's name in her ex-husband's handwriting and felt something move through her chest that was not grief and not anger, but the specific, devastating clarity of a truth that has been suspected for weeks and is now confirmed in ink. She closed the ledger. She put it inside her coat. She checked her watch. 14 minutes inside. She had time. She was pulling the vault door closed when she heard the footsteps outside the anteroom. Not the security rotation. The rotation moved in the specific rhythm she'd tracked. This was different, faster, purposeful, the sound of someone moving toward something specific. She pulled the vault closed as quietly as the mechanism allowed, moved to the left of the anteroom door, put her back to the wall. Her heartbeat was loud in her own ears, filling the small room with its information. The anteroom door opened. The man who stepped through was not building security. She knew him. Had seen him twice in the context of Damien's operational circle, a man named Stovic, who handled specific categories of problem resolution for Damien's organization, who communicated in the blunt physical vocabulary of someone whose utility was force rather than subtlety. He saw her immediately. The room was 4 meters by 3. He moved fast, faster than his size suggested, and she moved simultaneously, not away from him, but at a slight angle. The way Garrett had taught her during the 6 months she'd spent working out of Roman's operation, when it became clear that being Roman Castellano's wife, without any physical capability, was a liability she refused to maintain. She wasn't Garrett. She wasn't Roman's people. But she was not what Stovic expected, which was a woman against a wall with nowhere to go. She drove the heel of her hand into his nose. It wasn't cinematic. It was functional. The sound of cartilage compressing, the immediate flood of pain that made his eyes water involuntarily, the fraction of a second in which his forward momentum disrupted. She used that fraction, went past his left side, put herself between him and the door. He recovered faster than she'd hoped. His hand closed on her coat sleeve and he yanked. She felt the fabric pull, felt her balance taken. And the ledger shifted inside her coat, and she registered this with the specific panic of someone whose entire purpose is in danger of leaving their body. She twisted, felt the sleeve tear, got her arm free, and drove her elbow back into his solar plexus with the full rotation of her body behind it. He let go. She went through the door, into the corridor, and directly into the security guard making his rotation. He was younger than Stovic, early 30s, professional, the kind of building security that was retired law enforcement and took the job seriously. He clocked her in the moment she came through the door, his hand moving toward his radio. "Ma'am." "I'm a former resident," she said, still moving, not running. Running was a trigger. Running was flight, and flight was guilt visible from 15 meters. "I was retrieving personal items I left during my residency. I have building access." She kept moving. "I'm leaving now." He was already on the radio. She made the service corridor door. Behind her, she heard Stovic coming out of the anteroom, heard him say something to the security guard, heard the guard's voice change register, and then she was in the stairwell, and she stopped, not running, and ran. The lobby materialized below her, and she crossed it at a pace that was technically walking, and practically the fastest walking she'd ever done. Through the residential door, onto the street, cold air hitting her face like a correction, the surveillance vehicles at the corner still in her peripheral vision. She turned away from them, walked 1 block, turned right. Roman's car was there. She got in. Reyes was driving before the door fully closed. Roman looked at her torn sleeve, at her breathing, at whatever her face was doing. He looked at the space between her coat lapels where the outline of the ledger was visible. He said nothing. She pulled the ledger out and held it in her lap and looked at it and breathed. "Stovic was there," she said. "I know." Roman's voice was careful. "Building surveillance shows Damien left his dinner early, 20 minutes ago." She looked up. "He's on his way back," Roman said. "How long?" 8 minutes. Maybe less." She looked at the ledger in her lap. She looked at her hands holding it, one with a torn sleeve, both steady, the steadiness of a body that was still running on adrenaline and had not yet received full permission to acknowledge what had just happened. "Then we need to move faster than 8 minutes," she said. "There's a problem," Reyes said from the front seat. His voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering information he wishes were different. She looked at the rearview mirror. His eyes found hers. "The federal cars moved," he said. "Both of them. While you were inside." A pause. "They're not at the building anymore." "Where are they?" He looked at the road ahead. "One is 2 blocks behind us. The other," his eyes moved to the left side mirror, "is pulling alongside now." She turned. The black sedan was exactly where Reyes said, matching their speed in the adjacent lane, close enough that she could see the outline of 2 people in the front seats and the unmistakable deliberate patience of a vehicle that was not planning to pass. Roman's hand came to rest on his phone. "Don't," she said. "Seraphina, if you make a call right now, it confirms their surveillance was accurate and gives them probable cause to move." She held the ledger. Thought fast. "They're not stopping us. They're watching. There's a difference, and they are making it deliberately." "Why watch instead of stop?" Roman said. She thought about this for 3 seconds. "Because stopping me here gets them obstruction and a physical evidence dispute," she said. "Whatever Damien has offered them, it's not complete yet. They need him to make his final move. They need him to do something on record that closes the case they're building." She paused. "They're not here for me. They're here to watch what I do next and use it to find the thing they actually need. Which is you." She looked at him. "The case against you. Damien has been building it. But building a case against Roman Castellano requires evidence of current operational activity. They need to see a move, a real one." Her voice was steady. "If we respond to this the way they expect, if you call your people, if the operation goes loud, they get their documentation. They get Roman Castellano reacting to threat with the full operational response of an active criminal enterprise, and the federal case closes." Roman was looking at her. "So we don't run," she said. "We don't run," he said slowly. "We drive to an address that has nothing to do with your operation. We sit. We let them watch us sit." She held the ledger. "And tomorrow morning, I walk into the FBI field office on Federal Plaza, and I give them something better than whatever Damien promised them." The car was quiet. "The ledger," Roman said. "The ledger. The server extraction. The complete financial architecture of Damien Cross's trafficking operation, documented from primary sources, with my testimony as a direct witness to the originating authorization." She looked at him. "I give them Damien. In exchange for—" "Don't," Roman said. The word came out with the first real roughness she'd heard from him tonight. "Don't finish that sentence in front of me." "Roman." I said don't. His voice had something in it she'd heard only twice before. Both times in situations where the operational and the personal had collapsed into the same moment. What you're describing means walking into a federal building and making a deal that puts you inside their process, that puts you in front of prosecutors and defense attorneys and people who will use you to build the largest possible case. Yes. That is not, he stopped, jaw tight. That is not a safe position. No, she agreed. It isn't. The federal sedan continued alongside them, patient and inexorable. But it's the only position that ends this, she said. Not slows it down, not damages it, ends it. Damien in a cell, the trafficking operations documented and prosecuted. The people he moved, she stopped, steadied, continued. The people he moved through my grandfather's money given something that looks like accountability. She looked at the ledger in her lap, looked at her father's name in her ex-husband's handwriting. And whatever my father spent his last year afraid of, named, put in a record somewhere, made real. Roman was looking at the window. She could see the tension in his profile, the jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man containing something that wanted to move in a direction he wasn't permitting. The deal I make, she said quietly, will be specific, targeted. I am not Roman. Look at me. He looked at her. I am not trading you, she said. That is not what this is. I need you to believe that. Something moved in his face. Not release. He wasn't built for easy release, but a small, precise shift, like the first movement of a very heavy door. I believe you, he said. Then let me do this. Reyes took a left on a quiet block, and the federal sedan didn't follow, and they drove through the city that kept moving around them with its usual magnificent indifference, and Seraphina held the ledger and felt the weight of it. The physical weight, the paper and binding and ink, and the other weight, the weight of what it contained, of what it was going to require of her tomorrow, when she walked through a federal door with it in her hands and became the most important and exposed person in a very complicated legal situation. She looked at her own reflection in the dark car window. The woman looking back was someone she recognized. Not entirely, but enough. Roman said something to Reyes in a low voice. The car turned south. The city lights moved across the glass. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She looked at it. She answered. 3 seconds of silence on the line. Then Damien's voice. Not through an intermediary. His voice, direct, and in it something she'd never heard from him before in 4 years of marriage and 3 years after. Something that was very close to the sound a man makes when he has lost control of a situation he thought he owned completely. You took it, he said. Yes. A pause. Do you understand what you've done? Completely, she said. Seraphina. His voice shifted. And there it was, the thing underneath the control, the thing that sounded almost like desperation but wasn't quite, was something harder and colder. The sound of a man reassessing his position and finding it changed beyond his planned tolerance. If you walk that into a federal building, you lose everything. You lose him. They will use whatever you give them to build the case they've been building, and Roman Castellano will... Damien. He stopped. You married me because my grandfather built something you wanted access to, she said. You managed me and manipulated me, and used my hand and my eye and my thumb to unlock money that funded operations I cannot say out loud without wanting to burn every room I've stood in. She paused. You watched my father spend the last year of his life afraid and confused, and you did nothing because he was a variable that had already served its function. She stopped, breathed, continued. And you looked at me. In the first week of our marriage, and in the last and in every week between, and you saw someone soft. Someone manageable, someone who would never become someone you needed to be afraid of. The line was silent. How's that assessment looking right now, she said. A long pause. Then Damien's voice, very quiet, with something in it that she would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately name. What do you want? I want you in a room with federal prosecutors, she said. I want your operation documented in a public record. I want the people who... She stopped, held it. The people your operation moved, accounted for, named. She tightened her grip on the ledger. I want my father's name in a court document that says what was done to him. Another silence. And if I come to you, he said, if we negotiate directly before any "We're done negotiating," she said. "We were done negotiating the night I signed the divorce papers." She ended the call. She set the phone on the seat. Roman was looking at her. She looked back. She could feel her pulse in her hands and in the tight space beneath her ribs, and in the specific, exhausted clarity of someone who has been operating at maximum capacity for a very long time and is close, very close, to the moment when the capacity bill comes due. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Federal Plaza." He looked at her for a long time. "I'll have a lawyer there by 6, he said. "Roman, not for me," he said, "for you. A good one. Someone who understands the specific landscape of what you're walking into." His voice was even and certain and contained, underneath its evenness, something she could feel the outline of without being able to name precisely. "You are not walking in there alone." She looked at him. Outside the window, the city moved and blazed and continued. "Okay," she said. The car moved south through the cold and the light, and somewhere behind them, in a building on the east side, a man who had built his empire on the certainty of his own judgment was standing in a vault room looking at empty space where something used to be. Understanding for the first time what it cost to mistake softness for the absence of. She didn't sleep. She sat in the townhouse study with the ledger on the desk in front of her and the server extraction data on the left monitor, and a yellow legal pad she'd filled and turned and filled again on the right side of the desk. And she worked through the night with the specific focus of someone who understands that the quality of the next 12 hours will determine the shape of everything that comes after. The lawyer Roman had called, a woman named Adrienne Cho, 53 years old, who had spent 20 years in federal prosecution before crossing to defense work, and who arrived at the townhouse at 6:15 in the morning with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she'd been briefed thoroughly and found the situation complex but not unfamiliar, sat across from Seraphina for 2 hours and went through everything, every document, every chain, every gap. Adrienne asked questions the way surgeons cut, directly, without ceremony, removing everything unnecessary to get to the thing that mattered. She did not offer reassurance. She did not soften the outline of what Seraphina was walking into. She laid it flat on the table between them and let Seraphina look at it. "You understand the exposure," Adrienne said. "It wasn't a question. I authorized the biometric transfer," Seraphina said. "I know that's a vulnerability. They will attempt to argue that authorization constitutes knowing participation. The counter-argument is coercion by deception, that you were materially misled about the nature of what you were authorizing. That argument is defensible, but it requires your complete cooperation with the prosecution's case and your testimony to be consistent, detailed, and unimpeachable under cross. It will be." Adrienne looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression of someone who'd heard that claim before and knew how to evaluate it. Whatever she found in Seraphina's face, she nodded once and moved to the next document. "The ledger is primary evidence," she said. "The chain of custody is your testimony. You removed it from a property where you had recorded and unrelinquished access rights, which makes its legal status complicated but not fatal to its admissibility. The server extraction is the supporting architecture." She tapped the extraction summary. "Together they constitute the most comprehensive documentation of a trafficking network this office has seen outside of a multi-year federal investigation. Will it be enough? For Damien Cross?" Adrienne looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. "If you hold together on the stand, yes. More than enough." She paused. "For the ancillary network, that's the politicians, the corporate participants, the law enforcement contacts he's cultivated. It will open doors that will take years to fully walk through." "I know. And you're prepared for that process." "I'm prepared to start it," Seraphina said. "I don't think anyone is prepared for all of it." Adrienne looked at her for another moment. Then something moved in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the professional equivalent of respect, the recognition of a person who is being accurate about their own limits rather than performing confidence. "That's the right answer," she said. Roman was in the kitchen when Seraphina came down at 8:30. He was standing at the counter with coffee, not the toast of 2 nights ago, just the coffee, black, held in both hands, looking at the window. He looked like a man who had also not slept, which she knew because she'd heard him moving through the house at 4 in the morning, the particular sound of someone too engaged with their own thinking to lie still. She poured coffee. stood beside him at the window. Outside, the street was doing its ordinary morning things. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck double-parked with its hazards going. The city's complete indifference to everything that had happened inside this building over the previous 36 hours, which was both maddening and, in its way, steadying. The world's insistence on continuing was its own kind of argument for continuing with it. "Adrienne briefed you?" she said. "Last night, before she came to you." He looked at his coffee. "She's good." "I know she's good. You picked her." "I picked her for a reason." They stood in silence for a moment. The delivery truck moved on. "The cooperating witness," she said. "Did Garrett identify them?" A pause. "Yes," Roman said. "Who?" He looked at the window. "A man named Perez. He's been with me for 6 years. Damien approached him 14 months ago, found a debt Perez had run up with a competing operation, and offered to cover it in exchange for information." He stopped. He was feeding case documentation to Damien's federal contact, operational schedules, financial routing, names. "What happened to him?" "He's gone," Roman said, with the particular flatness that covered things he wasn't going to elaborate on in front of her. She didn't ask for elaboration. "The federal case against you," she said. "What Adrienne is offering them in exchange for my cooperation. It closes the cross-reference to your operation. It redirects it," Roman said carefully. "Adrienne's argument is that the federal investigation's primary asset, Damien's cooperation, is tainted by his own documented criminal activity. Once his operation is indicted, his cooperation agreement collapses. The case against me that he was building loses its informant architecture." He paused. "It doesn't make me untouchable. It removes the specific mechanism Damien constructed." "Which buys you time." "Which buys me exactly what I've always had," he said. "Time and distance and the permanent operational reality of being someone the federal government has never been able to fully build a case against because I am very careful and have been for a long time." She looked at him. "That's not a permanent solution." "No," he said. "It isn't." He turned to look at her, and his eyes had the quality she'd come to know as his most honest register. Direct and unadorned, none of the management that other people sometimes got. "Nothing about what I am is a permanent solution. You've known that since before you said yes." "I know." "And you're still here." "I'm still here," she said. He set down his coffee, looked at her with the full weight of everything he didn't perform, the care that lived in his specific quality of attention, in the way he'd put his jacket over her shoulders 3 years ago at a party he'd hated attending, in the way he'd sat beside her rather than across from her every time it mattered. In the 2 words, "I believe you." In the lawyer at 6:15 in the 35-minute window, and the hand in the dark car. "When this is over," he said. "When this is over," she agreed. It was enough. They understood each other at a compression ratio that most people couldn't achieve in a decade of trying. She picked up her coffee and drank it and looked at the ordinary street and prepared herself for the day. Man. Federal Plaza at 10 in the morning had the quality of all bureaucratic institutions built to process serious things. A seriousness that was architectural, that lived in the proportions of the building, in the security procedures, in the particular fluorescent light of rooms designed for function over comfort. Seraphina walked in with Adrienne beside her and the ledger in a document case, and 47 pages of prepared testimony, and the complete server extraction on an encrypted drive, and approximately 3 years' worth of financial analysis that she could reproduce in detail under questioning for as long as questioning required. She wore a gray suit, not the silver gown, not armor. Just a well-cut gray suit that said, "I am a person with professional credibility and specific expertise, and I am here to give you accurate and damaging information about a man who has been doing something terrible with other people's lives." The federal prosecutor assigned to receive her preliminary cooperation was a man named Hargrove, mid-40s, methodical, the kind of prosecutor who'd won cases not through theater, but through the accumulation of irrefutable detail. He looked at the document case. He looked at Adrienne. He looked at Seraphina. "You understand," he said, "that cooperation requires full disclosure. Everything you know, not a curated version." "I understand," Seraphina said, "including your own role in the financial transfer authorization." "Including that." He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who'd been lied to professionally for 20 years and had developed excellent calibration for the difference. "All right," he said, "let's start at the beginning." She opened the document case. She started at the beginning. It took 4 days. 4 days of 8-hour sessions in a room with no windows, with Hargrove and 2 associates and a court reporter, going through every document, every chain, every transaction, every date. Adrienne sat beside her for every hour of every day and intervened 12 times with legal precision when the questions moved toward territory that required management. Seraphina answered everything else without hesitation and without evasion, because evasion under these circumstances was its own category of mistake, and she did not make the same category of mistake twice. On the second day, Hargrove asked about Roman. "Your husband's organization," he said, with the careful phrasing of a man approaching a subject he'd been told was delicate. "In the context of your work identifying Damian Cross's financial architecture, did your access to Castellano's intelligence resources materially assist?" "No," Seraphina said. Adrienne didn't intervene. This was territory they'd prepared. "The financial analysis I'm providing was conducted using my own professional methodology, developed over 3 years of independent work, using documentation obtained through public records, legal archive access, and primary evidence I personally retrieved." She met Hargrove's eyes. "My husband provided security support during a period when I had credible reason to believe I was under physical threat from Cross's organization. That support did not constitute participation in the investigation and generated no evidence material to this case." Hargrove looked at her. "And your characterization of that support," he said carefully, "is documented in a way that is documented completely," Adrienne said, "and is the foundation of the cooperation agreement terms you've already reviewed." Hargrove looked at them both. He made a note. He moved on. On the third day, they went through the trafficking operation in detail. The documentation, the accounts, the movement records. Seraphina laid it out with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, the same quality of attention that had made her excellent at the work she did, the same refusal to allow emotional content to compromise analytical accuracy. She described what the instruments funded. She described the transfer authorization she'd provided on a Tuesday morning in a midtown lawyer's office. She described her father. She kept her voice level through all of it. Once, on the third day, late afternoon, going through a specific set of transfer records that corresponded to a date 6 weeks after her father's death, her voice stopped working for approximately 4 seconds. Hargrove waited. Adrienne did not touch her arm or speak. Seraphina looked at the document in front of her. She breathed through her nose. She continued. On the fourth day, Hargrove set down his pen at 2 in the afternoon and said, "I think we have what we need." Damian Cross was arrested on a Friday morning. She wasn't there. She was in the townhouse study with the monitors dark for the first time in 2 weeks, sitting with a cup of tea she'd made and not drunk, when Adrienne called. "It's done," Adrienne said. "Federal marshals took him at his residence at 7:45. His attorneys are filing for bond. Hargrove is opposing." A pause. "The trafficking charges are primary. The financial fraud is secondary. There are 11 additional warrants connected to the network documentation, 2 sitting politicians, a federal circuit judge, 4 corporate executives." Seraphina said nothing for a moment. "Seraphina, I heard you. This is going to be a long process," Adrienne said. "The trial preparation alone, I know. You'll be called to testify, multiple times, across multiple cases as the network prosecutions develop. It will not be—" "Adrienne," she stopped. "I know what it will be. I prepared for what it will be." She looked at the dark monitors. "Tell me one more thing." "What?" "Vivian." The word cost something. Not much. She had examined her feelings about Vivian with the same rigor she applied to everything, had found something complicated and ultimately adjacent to a pity she didn't entirely resent. "What happens to her?" A pause. "She's a potential witness," Adrienne said carefully. "Her level of knowledge about the operation is being assessed. There is currently no evidence she was an active participant in the criminal activity." "She wasn't," Seraphina said. "I don't know what she knew about the money, but she wasn't part of the operation." She paused. "The child had nothing." "The child is with Vivian," Adrienne said. "Whatever happens with the prosecution, the child is not implicated." Seraphina nodded at the empty room. Good, she said. She ended the call. She sat with the tea cooling in her hands and let herself feel, for the first time without management or quarantine, the full weight of everything she'd carried since the night she'd stood in a penthouse with broken crystal on the floor and watched the world reorganize itself into something unrecognizable. She felt the weight of her father, not the grief of losing him, which she'd processed across 3 separate years in 3 separate configurations, but the specific grief of knowing what his last year had been, the fear he'd carried, the confusion, the way he'd tried to protect her from it, which was the most precisely him thing she could imagine. Her father, who'd spent her entire childhood trying to ensure the world's difficult edges didn't reach her, protecting her to the end from a threat he couldn't name and she couldn't yet understand. She sat with that grief for a long time. She didn't try to resolve it. Some things weren't for resolving. They were for carrying, and the carrying itself was the tribute. 3 weeks later, she drove to her father's grave. It was a small cemetery outside the city, in Connecticut, where her father's family had been buried for 3 generations. She drove herself, not the armored car, not Garrett, just a rental car, and a 2-hour drive through November landscape doing its annual dying with considerable beauty. She arrived in the early afternoon when the light was low and golden and the cemetery was completely empty. She stood at the headstone for a while. She didn't speak. That had never been her register with him. They'd been quiet people together, she and her father, comfortable with the particular intimacy of presence without narration. She just stood there in the light and let him know she'd found it. Let him know what had been done had been named, that his name was in a federal record now, that said, this man was wronged, and here is precisely how, and here is the accounting. She didn't know if that was enough. She suspected it wasn't, and she suspected also that insufficiency was one of the permanent features of justice, that it always arrived after rather than before, always in the form of record rather than remedy, always imperfect and overdue. She stayed for 40 minutes. Then she drove back to the city. Roman was on the terrace of the townhouse when she returned, which surprised her. He rarely used the outdoor space, found it impractical, had the precise New Yorker's relationship to outdoor furniture that viewed it primarily as something other people used. He was standing at the railing with a glass of something, looking at the narrow strip of sky available between buildings, and he turned when she came through the terrace door. He looked at her face. "How was it?" he said. "Necessary," she said. He moved slightly to one side, not making room exactly, but adjusting his position at the railing in a way that said, "Here." She stood beside him. He didn't offer the glass and she didn't ask for it, and they stood in the November air and looked at the city together. "Hargrove called," Roman said. "I know. I'll call him back tomorrow. He has a timeline for the preliminary hearing. Adrienne told me." He was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. "The circuit judge in the warrant network," he said carefully. He had a case on his docket 18 months ago, a wrongful death civil suit filed by the family of a woman who died in circumstances connected to one of Damien's trafficking operations. He paused. The judge dismissed it on procedural grounds. With the warrant, the dismissal is being reviewed. She understood what he was saying, the scope of what Damien's network had touched, the specific weight of lives it had moved through and damaged, was larger than she'd let herself fully see while she was inside the operational work. She was seeing it now. It was considerable. It was going to keep being considerable for a long time. "How many civil cases?" she said. "Hargrove's office is still counting." She nodded. She looked at the strip of sky. It was turning the color it turns in November at 4 in the afternoon, a blue so dark it was almost honest about becoming night. "I want to do something with the money," she said. Roman looked at her. "The recovered assets from my grandfather's accounts, whatever the federal process returns, if anything is returned after the seizures, and whatever I have from the settlement." She'd reached an agreement with Damien's civil estate attorneys the week before, conducted through Adrienne, structured around the documentation of the biometric transfer and the fraudulent misrepresentation of the marriage itself. She wasn't wealthy from it, but she had resources she hadn't had before. "I want to do something specific with it." "What specifically?" "Advocacy, survivor support, the legal infrastructure for the families in those civil cases." She paused. Something that cost Damien's legacy the way his operation cost the people it ran through. Something that uses what he took from my family to repair what he took from other families. Roman looked at her for a moment. Adrienne will know the structure for it, he said. I know. I'll talk to her. She paused. I'm telling you first. He was quiet for a beat. Why? She looked at him. Because you're the person I tell things to first. That's what this is. She held his eyes. And because you should know who you're standing with, not who you thought you were standing with, who I'm actually going to be. He looked back at her with the expression she'd spent a year learning to read, the one that looked like stillness but was in fact the opposite, was in fact the full engagement of everything he was, every careful and difficult and compromised and genuine thing brought to bear on this moment. I know who I'm standing with, he said. Tell me. He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. Someone who went into a vault in the middle of a federal surveillance operation to get a ledger with her father's name in it, he said. Who spent 4 days in a windowless federal room giving accurate testimony about the worst thing that ever happened to her without once making it smaller than it was. He paused. Who is standing on a terrace in November talking about what to do with the money before she's finished processing what it costs to get it. She absorbed this. That sounds exhausting, she said. It sounds like you, he said. She looked at the darkening sky and felt the cold in her hands and the tiredness in her body. The real tiredness. The accumulated weight of weeks and months and years. The tiredness that lived underneath the operational focus and was waiting patiently for the operational focus to finally stand down. It was standing down now. She could feel it happening in stages, the way a body unclench after a long-held tension. Careful and incremental and a little painful in the places where holding had become habitual. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. He was solid and present and warm through his jacket, and he didn't move except to set down his glass and put his arm around her in the particular way he had. Not performative, not possessive, just the arm of a person who was choosing to hold on to something he didn't take for granted. They stood like that until the sky finished turning. The trial began the following spring. Seraphina testified on the 4th day. She wore the same gray suit. She sat in the witness box in a federal courtroom in downtown Manhattan and answered questions for 6 hours across 2 days, and she did not look at Damien Cross during any of it because she had made a deliberate decision that her testimony was not for him. It was for the record. It was for Hargrove's case. It was for her father's name in a document that would outlast all of them. It was for the families in the civil suits whose attorneys were present in the gallery and who Seraphina had met, through Adrienne, in the weeks preceding the trial, meetings that had been among the most difficult and necessary things she'd done in a life that had recently accumulated a significant number of difficult and necessary things. On the 2nd day of her testimony, during a recess, she walked past the plaintiff's gallery and a woman in the 2nd row, 50s, with the specific tiredness of someone who has been fighting something for a long time without certainty of outcome, reached out and touched Seraphina's hand. She didn't say anything. Neither did Seraphina. The touch lasted approximately 2 seconds. It was enough. The verdict came on a Wednesday in June. Seraphina was in Connecticut when Adrienne called, not at the cemetery this time, but at a small coffee shop in a town she'd driven to for no particular reason on a morning when staying in the city felt like the wrong choice. She was reading. She'd started reading again 3 months ago. Not financial documents, not case materials, just books. The kind she'd read before her life had contracted around its own crisis. The kind her father had kept in careful shelves in his study. The phone rang. Guilty, Adrienne said. All primary counts, 7 of the 11 secondary counts. The judge has scheduled sentencing for August. Seraphina set down her book. The civil suits? The favorable verdict removes the last procedural barrier. Hargrove's office is coordinating with the plaintiff attorneys. The asset recovery from the seized estate. Adrienne paused, and in the pause, Seraphina could hear the particular quality of a lawyer delivering a number, is larger than initially projected, significantly. She looked out the coffee shop window at the Connecticut street. A normal street. Trees in June leaf. A woman pushing a stroller. The unremarkable continuity of ordinary life proceeding in its ordinary way. How significantly, she said. Adrienne told her. She sat with the number. Adrienne? Yes. I need you to start the foundation paperwork. A brief pause. I already drafted it, Adrienne said. I had a feeling about today. Seraphina laughed. Came out unexpected. Not a polite sound, not a managed sound, but the real thing. The kind of laugh that arrives without permission and is its own evidence of something returning. Of course you did, she said. I'll send the draft tonight, Adrienne said, and there was something in her voice too, something that in a different register might have been called warmth, and in Adrienne Cho's register was the professional equivalent of it. Thank you, Seraphina said, for all of it. Don't thank me, Adrienne said. Come to my office next week and we'll talk structure. She ended the call. She sat in the coffee shop in Connecticut on a June Wednesday with the book in her hands and the number in her head and the word guilty, settling through her like something that had been held at a distance for a long time and had finally been permitted to arrive. She waited to feel triumphant. She'd expected triumph, had imagined it approximately as the closing of something, the clean sensation of a door sealed at last. What she felt was quieter and less legible than triumph. It was closer to the particular tiredness that comes after a long physical journey. Not emptiness, but the specific depletion of a body that has moved a long way and arrived and is now, for the first time, permitted to acknowledge what the moving cost. She felt her father in it. She felt the 4 years and the 3 years and all the years before that, when she was simply a woman trying to build a life, and not yet the woman the building of that life would eventually require her to become. She felt all of it. She let herself feel it there in the coffee shop, over a cup that had gone cold. Then she picked up her phone and called Roman. He answered on the second ring. Guilty, she said. A pause on the line. She could hear him breathing. All primary counts, he said. All of them? Another pause. Come home, he said. 2 words. Exactly right. I'm 2 hours away, she said. I know. She could hear something in his voice that he didn't perform and couldn't hide, something that lived in the lower register of everything he was, underneath the operational and the careful and the controlled. Drive safe. She drove back through the June landscape, the trees full and the light long and the highway moving beneath her with its indifferent efficacy. And she thought about her father, and she thought about the woman she'd been in the penthouse when the crystal broke on the marble floor, and she thought about the vault and the ledger and the gray suit and the windowless room. She thought about Tomas Varga, who had made a choice that was small and terrified and wrong, and she found she could hold this without the previous heat of it, found it had settled into something more like a fact about people, about how fear shrinks the moral architecture, about how betrayal is sometimes less about malice than about the specific cowardice of someone who couldn't hold their ground. She didn't forgive him, but she understood him, and understanding turned out to cost less than she'd expected. She thought about Vivian. She thought about the child who would grow up without a father in the capacity a child deserved, which was not the capacity Damien Cross had been in any case. She thought about this carefully and found the same complicated territory she'd always found there. Something unresolvable, something requiring acknowledgement without resolution. She let it be unresolved. The city appeared in the distance, the particular Manhattan silhouette that she had hated once, during a year when it meant the skyline of someone else's world she was trying to belong to, and had come to love in the specific way of someone who'd finally learned to navigate a place on her own terms. Her phone showed a text from Roman. I made dinner. She looked at this for a long moment at a red light. She thought about him, about the full and complicated fact of him, about who he was and what that meant, and what it required of her and what she required of it, about the permanent imperfect negotiation of loving someone whose world would never be fully safe, whose past was irrevocable, whose future was conditional on a careful and durable vigilance that would never entirely stand down. She was clear-eyed about all of this. She had been from the beginning, but she also thought about his hand in the dark car, about beside rather than across, about the way he'd stood in the cold outside the building on the east side, not crowding her, just present, available without demand, the arm of someone who chose to hold on. She thought about what he'd said on the terrace. I know who I'm standing with. The light changed. She drove home. 6 months later, the Seraphina Vale Foundation made its first grants. 12 organizations, survivor advocacy, legal aid, case support for the families in the civil suits that were moving now. Slowly, with the institutional friction of all legal processes, but moving. Adrienne had structured it cleanly, efficiently, with the particular satisfaction of a person whose professional skills were being used for something she found worth doing. On the morning the first grant letters went out, Seraphina stood in the study that had once been Roman's and was now simply theirs. The monitors showing the Foundation's preliminary case tracking system, the whiteboard on the east wall cleared of financial architecture and holding, in her handwriting, a list of organization names. And she looked at the room and felt it as the room it had become, which was different from what it had been. She didn't stand there long. She had a meeting. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, checked the time. She was walking toward the door when Roman appeared in the hallway, on his way somewhere himself, jacket on, phone in hand, and they passed each other in the entrance with the particular efficiency of two people whose lives had become structurally integrated, who moved around each other in a shared space with the ease of long practice. He touched her hand as she passed. She caught his fingers briefly. Then they went their separate ways into the city, into the cold and the noise and the indifferent, magnificent machinery of a place that kept moving regardless, that had never paused for her grief or her rebuilding or her long, patient reconstruction of herself from the materials left by disaster. She moved through it now with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were made of, not because she'd been tested and survived. Survival alone didn't produce this. It was something more precise. She knew what she was made of because she had been required over the course of 5 years to use every part of it. To use the grief and the intelligence and the patience and the controlled rage and the love she'd protected even when protecting it looked like hardness from the outside. She had used all of it in the specific service of something that mattered, and the use had clarified her the way fire clarifies certain materials, not destroying but revealing the essential structure, the thing that persisted. She walked through the city. She was 32 years old, and she was not soft. She had never been soft. She had simply been, for a time, in the hands of someone who had required softness from her and called what she had instead by the wrong name. And the error had been his, and the correction had been hers, and the cost of the correction had been paid in full by everyone who had earned the pain. The city moved around her, uncaring and blazing. She moved through it like someone who belonged there, like someone who had always belonged there, even when she'd forgotten, even when she'd been made to forget, like the woman they had been afraid she'd be. And she was.